This is part 2 of my vintage Kyosho Lazer ZX project. As you can see, basically the roller is completely finished. I do have one or two things I'd like to try on it, but for all practical purposes, this is all done. So at the end of the first video, I believe I had part of the front drivetrain done. I commented on the belts, how the original belts that I had used had too thick of a spine and it was binding against the drivetrain. So I purchased Lazer ZX belts from Tough Racing. They have a thinner spine and it fits perfectly and works very nicely. Beyond that, I had to go through and do the rear drivetrain, the suspension and everything. So I'll go over first the rear drivetrain. One thing that I had to do was order a set of pulley rollers. I think I mentioned that in the first video because a few of them were missing from the gearbox. I got those in, installed them, they're fine. One thing you can do though, instead of using those rollers, because that roller is really like a brass bushing, you could get ball bearings of the same size. I believe it's a 2mm by 6mm bearing, and you can use those rather than those stock rollers to give you the same belt tension in there and give you a little less friction in the drivetrain. I did order a set of 2x6 bearings. I think they're 2x6, but I did not install them. I just did kind of a stock build here. Maybe if I want to tear this whole thing apart and put in those bearings, I'll do that. But that is an option, and you should consider that if you want a little more free movement in the drivetrain. The slipper clutch was relatively straightforward to put together. The instructions were decent enough to not have too much of a problem with that, although it was a little challenging just having the amount of manual dexterity you would need to hold the lay shaft in with one bearing in place and then have this all tightened down and put everything together. It's hard to explain just verbally. Since I already built it, I can't show you, but it's a straightforward assembly, but it's still a little challenging, I would say, just to put everything together. Let's see. So I'd like to comment a little bit on the slipper clutch and the associated lay shaft versus the stock lay shaft, which had the center differential. So the center differential that came with the Lazer ZX was set up in a way so that the, how do I put this? The part of the pulley that drives the front differential is locked to the lay shaft. And the pulley that drives the rear differential is really where the center differential is adjusting power to. So what that basically means is that you always end up with full power being applied to the front, and you're adjusting that center diff to determine how much power you're going to apply to the rear. So if it's fully locked, you have a 50-50 front-rear power distribution. If it's not fully locked, then you have more power going to the front than to the rear. So on a low traction surface, this is very useful because you can force the car to push a little bit coming out of turns, which when you don't have a lot of bite is very helpful. It keeps you from spinning out. But on high grip surfaces, it can actually be harmful because you end up not applying full power to the rear, and so the car wants to pull coming out of turns. It's not very fast. So the ZX-R comes with a slipper clutch, and a lot of people used with the ZX just replaced the center diff with a slipper clutch or just fully locked the center diff. Okay, so that covers that. I actually ended up picking up a second Lazer ZX, which was in very good condition, and it had MIP shiny CVDs, and I picked it up really primarily for that because I wanted to port those over to this chassis, which you can see here, front and rear. Those are very hard to find on their own, so I figured that secondary chassis was a decent find. One thing I did notice, though, is that as the suspension compresses in the rear, the dog bone is pushing up against the differential and creating stress on the differential housing. that may have something to do with either the length of the dog bone being different from the stock dog bones, or the fact that this particular chassis is using Lazer ZX5 rear aluminum hub carriers. I did order a set of the stock molded hub carriers. They just haven't come in the mail yet, but when I do, I'll put them in and see if that gives me a slightly different offset so that I don't get this binding between the dog bone and the inside of the diff outdrive. Maybe a little hard to see, but if I compress the suspension, you'll see what I mean. That dog bone moves in a little bit as the suspension compresses, and it eventually reaches a limit, and it creates bind in the suspension, and it tries to push the gearbox in this direction. Likewise on this side, it does kind of the same thing, but it's more prevalent on the right side than the left side. So potentially an issue. We'll see what happens when the stock molded parts come in. I'll install those. As for the suspension, I kept the stock gold shocks front and rear. The only change I made was to add low-C big bore springs, so I get zero binding between the springs and the shock body. And I had to use, I think, some Traxxas big bore spring cups at the top just to keep the spring from popping around this shock collar here. Holds it in pretty nicely. Suspension is quite smooth. At the front, it is worth noting that the Fiberlight front shock tower has mounting holes principally for the ZXR, which I believe had a longer front shock. These front gold shocks for the Kyosho Lazer are the short shocks. The rear ones are the long shocks. The ZXR, I believe, used the medium-sized gold shocks for the front, which is more appropriate for these mounting holes here. So in order to get the short shocks to work, you have to use the innermost mounting hole on the suspension arm and the lowermost mounting hole on the shock tower. You could mount it in other holes, but then your ride height will be very low at the front because it's just going to pull this whole thing up. And so you won't have very good ground clearance at the front. You could, if you wanted to, drill a few more holes in the shock tower, but I'm not really interested in doing that. Another thing to note, last time for the part 1 video, I commented on these alloy front C-hubs and how I had to use spacers to make sure that the front steering knuckle did not bind against the C-hubs, and also just to get everything to fit right. It turns out that there's a much simpler way of addressing this. These front C-hubs, although there were no instructions with it, so there was nothing to indicate that it was designed this way, but it turns out that all you need to do is get 4x8mm flanged bearings and mount them with the flange on the inside of the C-hubs. And that gives you the spacing you need to mount this steering knuckle appropriately so that there's no play and there's no bind between the steering knuckle and the C-hub. So I tried that out, works great, fits just fine. Let's see. I think that's pretty much it. This would be a very nice shelf queen. I don't intend on really running it, although again I do have, let me just see if I can get it out here, just a second. Another Lazer ZX that would be an appropriate runner. So that's the shelf queen with all the nice carbon parts. This is the runner with the original, I believe that this would appear to be a graphite chassis. It has most of the parts of the ZXR, so the slipper clutch, front and rear ball diffs, ZXR shock towers. The only difference is that it has a 2-piece upper deck, which was from the original Lazer ZX. The ZXR had a 1-piece upper deck. But otherwise it is indistinguishable from a ZXR, with the exception, of course, of these associated shocks. But it's pretty decent condition. Maybe I'll use it as a runner, we'll see. But for the shelf queen, it's this guy. I also installed the carbon fiber steering brace for the front. Not sure if I showed that last time. The turnbuckles I used here are from 3 Racing. You can go, I got these particular turnbuckles from tqracing.com. They have a whole assortment of 3 Racing titanium turnbuckles, and those are the cheapest titanium turnbuckles I've been able to find, and they work just fine. The only thing is the square piece here that you would use a wrench for is smaller in its size than what you would use for like the Lunsford turnbuckles. The Lunsford turnbuckles come with a wrench, and that wrench is larger than this. So I just use needle nose pliers and adjust these turnbuckles that way. So just something to note if you're going to use these 3 racing turnbuckles. You need a smaller wrench or just some needle nose pliers and you're good to go. Let's see. I think that's it. I guess the other thing to mention is the one-way unit here on the Lazer ZX. This is a pretty cool thing about the Lazer, that the one-way is adjustable. There's this silver piece here, which is a friction plate that you can screw against the housing of the one-way pulley that drives the front diff. And so if you want it to completely lock, you just screw this nut down. If you want to loosen it up, there's a little grub screw in here. You loosen that out, and then you loosen this nut, screw the grub screw back in to hold this in place. Then you have a little looser action here. You get more one-way action to the front. Can't remember if I covered that in the first video, but I just wanted to point that out. This is a nice feature of the Lazer ZX that you will not really see on the other vintage four-wheel drive chassis, mainly the Schumacher Cat 2000, the Yokomo YZ10, and the Tamiya Avanti. The Avanti does come with a center diff, but there's no adjustable one-way unit. The Cat 2000 has the option to use either a one-way center pulley or a clicker center pulley, so you have some adjustability there, but you have to swap the parts out. The Yokomo YZ10 has no adjustability for the one-way center pulley. At least on the 93 Works, 94, and Pavitas models, it's just a one-way center pulley, and that's it. It's 100% one-way. There's no way to adjust it. On the 870, in one of my videos, I talked about the possibility of making it partially adjustable. I am working on something for the 94 YZ10 that may make it adjustable. If it works, I'll make a video for that. But otherwise, this is it. In time, I will, of course, get a body and paint it and put the wing on, but that's all aesthetics. I don't think that's terribly important for this video. So that's it for now, and thanks for watching.